learn about my best friend's husband sees and knows everything. Cross-contextual and cross-country approach to understanding smart home privacy.
Alright, so I'm Tess from the University of California, Berkeley, and as introduced, I'll be talking about our paper, My Best Friend's Husband Sees and Knows Everything, which is a cross-contextual and cross-country approach to understanding smart home privacy. And before I begin, I just want to say that this was a really large collaborative effort. As you can see, there's a lot of institutions on the bottom, and it certainly wouldn't have been possible without all the other authors on the paper. All right, to give some background, as we know, smart home devices collect data from many different types of users. So maybe some of us have had the experience where you go into someone's home and you don't necessarily know if they have a camera or they have a smart speaker. So a couple different types of users. First, primary users we considered, and those are people who have control over these devices. So some characteristics of a primary user in this case could be people who have an account profile on the device or have control over the device configuration or control over those privacy settings. However, we also want to consider bystanders, other people interacting with a device, such as guests in a smart home or in-home workers. And there's a wealth of existing work and literature on bystanders and smart home privacy. So for our paper, what we wanted to do is we wanted to narrow in the scope and focus on differences across contexts and countries in smart home device concerns, adoption processes, and privacy preferences, since we think this is an interesting, understudied area that can add some nuance to the existing bystander literature. Okay, so when I'm talking about contexts, here we covered two contexts for our participants. We had them analyze the privacy in their own home and in other people's homes that they visited. For countries, we looked at 4 countries. We looked in Mexico, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Ideally, in an ideal world, we would have surveyed all the countries, but for scope, we did those 4. All right, so we asked 3 core research questions across those 4 countries and across the 2 contexts. The first research questions is, what are the people's adoption patterns, usage patterns, and configuration processes? The second question we asked was, what are people's concerns and privacy perspectives on smart home devices? And the third was, how do people protect their privacy? What mechanisms do they use in around smart home devices? And in an ideal world, what privacy protections can they imagine or do they wish existed? How did we do this? We conducted a large-scale prolific survey with 1,459 participants, and notably we did this in 2 languages. We did it in both English and Spanish, and across those 4 countries I mentioned. You can see a kind of a breakdown of our participants here. We had more participants take the survey in English than Spanish, but in all of the countries we deployed the survey in both. You can see, not surprisingly, we didn't have that many participants in Germany who took it in Spanish, and we had many more participants in Mexico taking it in Spanish than English. For our methods, we performed both qualitative and quantitative analysis of the survey responses. We used inductive thematic analysis in both English and Spanish for our free response questions. For our multiple choice questions, we used descriptive and inferential statistics. All right, getting into some of the major themes that we saw in our free answer responses. The first one was a sense of pervasive data collection and sharing. So the first one is kind of an outlier comment, but I still wanted to highlight it because it's pretty creepy. Yeah, so they mentioned that their partner had installed security cameras to basically monitor their activity. The second participant here also talked about pervasive data collection. They said that the more smart devices there are, the less privacy. All right, our second theme that we saw was uncertainty about what data is collected and what data is shared. The first participant mentioned you don't know when they're recording you, and the second participant said they aren't certain that anyone had hit a camera, but they don't like the idea of it, which makes sense. Our third theme was control is subject to different power dynamics and social norms. In the first quote here, they felt that smart devices listen too much and transfer data, and they don't have control over that data that's being transferred. They also mentioned some control based on the social norms in other people's houses, and this makes sense. If you go into someone else's house, you might not feel comfortable asking them to unplug the device depending on your relationship. So they said they have to respect other people's homes and how they run their home. Participants also talked about trade-offs between benefits of the smart home devices and a feeling that it was necessary for them to lose the privacy for the benefits. So this participant talked about the feeling constantly watched, but it's the fair price they feel they have to pay because they need to feel safer. The last theme that I'll talk about briefly is a sense that there's privacy protection due to trust in other people in those social relationships and also our institutions. So for example, in the first quote, since there's millions of dollars in privacy research, there are no more problems, so it's all fine. And yes, wouldn't that be nice if it's true? And then since we're in the United Kingdom, some people talked about regulation and having trust in the regulation protecting them. So they said that under UK law, they have the right to be informed. And so this participant wasn't particularly concerned, but they weren't really sure exactly whether the data was encrypted, etc. Okay, just to sum it up, those are major themes that we saw across all of our research questions: pervasive data collection, uncertainty about data collection, power dynamics and social norms leading to control, and then trade-offs, and finally protection. Okay, now I'll dive into our research questions. So for our first research question, we looked at the adoption patterns, usage patterns, and configuration processes. I'm just going to highlight a couple of results for each research question because there were lots, and I would just encourage you to take a look at the paper if you want to see all of the results. For device adoption, one interesting result was that male participants and younger participants were much more likely to be involved with the device adoption process. For device adoption, we looked at deciding to get, purchasing, and owning the device. For usage across countries, we saw that participants in Mexico were the most likely to use a device at least weekly in someone else's home. And the device usage didn't vary meaningfully across gender, which is interesting because it means that the previous results on the previous slide about adoption aren't due to gendered usage differences. Somewhat similarly, for device control, we saw that male participants were the most likely to have control over the device settings and privacy configuration of devices. For our second research question, we looked at concerns and privacy perspectives. Looking across contexts, we saw that there were more concerns about devices generally in their own homes. However, when we looked in other people's homes, people were much more concerned about video. And this is kind of intuitively makes sense, especially with the idea of hidden cameras. People were very concerned, especially about hidden cameras in other people's homes. Looking across countries, we saw participants in Mexico were the most likely to be comfortable with devices, but they also were the most likely to have concerns about devices. All right, so finally our third research question. We looked at people's privacy mechanisms and their desired privacy options. In other people's homes, participants were much more likely to change their behavior when interacting with a device compared to in their own homes. So an example of this is in other people's homes, maybe if they're interacting with a smart speaker and they don't want the smart speaker to collect their data, they would change their own speaking behavior or navigate to another room in order to have that conversation. But in their own homes, they're more likely to take protection mechanisms such as simply unplugging the device or changing the settings to not collect the data that they don't want. And then finally, across countries, participants in the US and Mexico were generally more likely to use privacy protection mechanisms compared to participants in the United Kingdom and Germany. And one more, privacy options. So privacy options were much more similar across contexts, so across both people's own homes and other people's homes, compared to those privacy mechanisms. So what that means is that people were interested in having the same privacy options in an ideal world in both contexts, but there were kind of practical limitations in what actual mechanisms they could take due to maybe the social norms. So what options did people want? They wanted control over data collection, control over data use, and access control. So not the most surprising options, but still interesting that they're more similar across contexts and the mechanisms. All right, with that, I'll mostly wrap up. So a couple quick takeaways. So cross context, unsurprisingly, video cameras are a big concern in other people's homes for participants. Protection mechanisms varied across homes, but the options were pretty similar. The desired options were pretty similar. For cross-country takeaways, participants in Mexico were the most likely to be comfortable, but also most likely to have concerns. And then participants in the US and Mexico use more protection mechanisms. This is kind of interesting because it's possible, we're not sure based on these results, but it's possible there's a story where participants in Mexico are more comfortable because of the protection mechanisms. And we haven't been able to draw the line between those definitively, but it is an interesting thing that could be considered in future studies. Yeah, with that, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for funding sources. Please reach out if you have questions.
So I was interested in whether they were all in similar home situations, apartments or houses, and whether they were also the same socioeconomic, especially with Mexico and the greater willingness to have the surveillance type.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for the first part of the question, no, they're in different homes. And I don't have the exact breakdown for our demographics, but it's in the paper, so you can definitely take a look. But we try to balance the socioeconomic categories. So we deploy some prolific study and then balance across income, and we did it across income groups, for example.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. If I remember well, in your the previous slide, you say that people from US and Mexico tend to use more privacy-enhancing behavior and so on. Do you have any idea why? The only thing that comes to me as an idea is either they care more about their privacy or they tend to have less trust, maybe. Do you have any data about that or ideas? Or?
We don't have definitive data, but I do have some general ideas. I think it could potentially be due to a lack of trust in regulation or more device exposure or more concern about devices in their home. Yeah, I don't think it's entirely clear from the data, though. It definitely would be an interesting follow-on.
Hi, thank you. Interesting work. So I was wondering, did you have any hypotheses starting this work? So what was your initial motivation to look at this?
Our initial motivation was wondering if different countries would have different perspectives. We kind of suspected that participants in Germany would have some more privacy concerns, which we did end up seeing, and yeah, we didn't have any very, very specific.
And did you also take into account market penetration of these technologies? Because maybe in Germany it's used less in general.
We talked about that a little bit in our paper, but we didn't measure it. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, good work. Just a comment, really. The last point you mentioned in the slides about controls, particularly people in Mexico, it just made me think of, there was a paper from about 10 years ago, Laura Brandemart and Alessandro Acquisti on the control paradox, and basically what they found is that when users are given privacy controls, they're more likely to divulge information because they feel like they're in control even if they're not. And so this might just be an example of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So these devices have sometimes very different policies in terms of who can control and how many people can control these devices. I mean, we myself at home, we have different brands, and with my husband basically we find surprises. Oh, this one we can have, this one we need to have a same password so we can share. Have you looked into this? And because normally the user it's an out surprise after you buy the device, how you can manage it. I mean, so.
We didn't look at the specific controls, but we did break down our results by device.
So this was all targeted at in-home. Did you look at devices like in a restaurant or something like that? And especially if it's maybe a neighborhood restaurant where there might be some relationship with the owner, so it's not as impersonal as walking into a McDonald's where there's no way you have any interaction in a meaningful sense.
Yeah, I think bystander privacy in communities is also extremely interesting. We just looked at in-home though.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Moving on.